Sarah woke to the sound of roosters crowing and sunlight streaming through the bedroom window. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then, the memories came flooding back. The bus ride, the saloon, Jake's unexpected kindness. She checked her phone and saw it was barely 6 in the morning. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood in the kitchen of her grandmother's house and marveled at how much had changed. The electricity was working, the plumbing no longer groaned and leaked, and the windows sparkled in the morning sun. Jake had been true to his word about helping, showing up every morning with tools and an endless supply of patience. "Hand me that wrench," Jake called from under the kitchen sink, where he was making final adjustments to the new faucet. Sarah knelt down beside him, close enough to smell his soap and see the concentration on his face. Over the past few weeks, she had learned to appreciate Jake's quiet competence and dry sense of humor. He never made her feel foolish for not knowing how to do things, and he had a gift for explaining complicated repairs in simple terms. "There," he said, emerging from under the sink and turning on the new faucet. Clear water flowed smoothly without any of the sputtering and brown color that had marked the old plumbing. "It's perfect," Sarah said, and meant it. The kitchen was starting to feel like a real room again, with fresh paint on the walls and Eleanor's dishes arranged in the clean cabinets. Jake wiped his hands on a rag and looked around the room with satisfaction. "Your grandmother would be happy to see this place coming back to life." Sarah had been thinking the same thing. Each repair and improvement felt like a gift to Eleanor's memory, a way of honoring the woman who had maintained this ranch for so many years. "I want to show you something," Sarah said, leading Jake to the office where she had been organizing Eleanor's papers. "I found this yesterday." She handed him a folder marked Ranch Records. Inside were detailed notes about cattle breeding, crop rotations, and financial records going back 20 years. Eleanor had been methodical about tracking every aspect of the ranch operation. She was thinking about expanding the cattle herd, Sarah said, pointing to notes in Eleanor's handwriting. And she had plans for a larger vegetable garden. Jake studied the papers carefully. "These are good plans. Your grandmother understood this land and what it could produce. Do you think I could actually do it? Run cattle and grow vegetables?" "I think you could do whatever you set your mind to," Jake said. "You've learned to repair plumbing and install electrical fixtures in 3 weeks. Before that, had you ever held a wrench?" Sarah laughed. "I didn't even own a screwdriver before I came here." Jake's expression grew serious. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Are you staying because you want to, or because you feel obligated to your grandmother?" Sarah had been asking herself the same question. At first, she had been motivated primarily by necessity and curiosity. But, as the weeks passed, and the house became more livable, she had discovered something unexpected. "I love it here," she said simply. "I love waking up to see the mountains. I love the quiet. I love feeling like the work I do actually matters." Jake smiled. "Good answer." That afternoon, they walked the property together, with Jake pointing out fence lines that needed repair and discussing where Sarah might want to plant her garden. They stopped at the old apple orchard, where Eleanor's grandfather's trees were beginning to bud with spring growth. "Your grandmother used to make apple butter from these trees," Jake said. "Best I ever tasted. She would give jars to everyone in town." Sarah picked up a fallen branch and imagined herself following the same tradition. "Will you teach me to make apple butter?" "I don't know how to make it," Jake admitted. "But Betty might. Eleanor probably gave her the recipe." They continued walking toward the back pasture, where Jake had been checking the condition of the grass and fencing. Sarah had learned that good pasture management was essential for raising healthy cattle. "Jake," she said as they walked, "can I ask you something personal?" He glanced at her sideways. "Shoot, why haven't you ever gotten married? You're kind, reliable, good-looking. In Chicago, women would be lined up around the block for a guy like you." Jake stopped walking and looked out across the pasture. For a moment, Sarah thought she had overstepped and made him uncomfortable. "I was engaged once," he said finally, "to a woman named Lisa from Denver. She was a lawyer, very successful, very ambitious. What happened? She couldn't understand why I wanted to live way out here instead of in the city. She thought ranching was a hobby I would eventually outgrow." Jake picked up a small stone and threw it toward the creek. "She wasn't wrong about the challenges. It's a hard life, and it's not for everyone. Sarah sensed there was more to the story, but she didn't want to pry. Do you ever regret choosing this life? No, Jake said without hesitation. This land gets into your blood. Once you understand what it means to be connected to a place, to really belong somewhere, it's hard to give that up for anything else. They walked back toward the house in comfortable silence. Sarah was beginning to understand what Jake meant about belonging somewhere. For the first time in her life, she felt like she had found a place where she fit. That evening, Sarah cooked dinner for both of them in her newly functional kitchen. It was a simple meal: grilled chicken, vegetables from Betty's garden, and bread from the bakery in town. But eating it in her own house, at her grandmother's table, felt like a celebration. I have something to tell you, Sarah said as they finished eating. Jake looked up from his plate, his expression curious. I called my Aunt Margaret today and told her I'm staying. Permanently. How did she take it? She was surprised, but I think she understood. She said she could hear something different in my voice, something more confident. Jake nodded. You are different than you were 3 weeks ago. More settled. Sarah had noticed the change too. The constant anxiety that had plagued her in Chicago was gone, replaced by a sense of purpose and belonging. There's something else, she continued. I want to buy some cattle. Start small, maybe a dozen head, and see how it goes. Jake leaned back in his chair, considering. That's a big step. Are you sure you're ready? I've been reading Eleanor's notes and some books from the library. I know I have a lot to learn, but I have to start somewhere. You'll need help, especially at first. Cattle can be unpredictable, and there's a lot to learn about feeding, breeding, and healthcare. Sarah looked at Jake across the table. Over the past few weeks, she had come to depend on his knowledge and support. More than that, she had begun to care about him in ways that went beyond gratitude. Would you consider partnering with me? She asked. I mean, combining our operations somehow? You know cattle, and I'm willing to learn. Together, we might be able to make both ranches more profitable. Jake was quiet for a long time, studying her face. That's not a decision to make lightly, he said finally. Business partnerships can be complicated. I know, but I trust you, and I think you trust me. We work well together. We do work well together, Jake agreed. But there's something else we should probably talk about. Sarah felt her heart begin to beat faster. What's that? The fact that I'm falling in love with you. The words hung in the air between them. Sarah stared at Jake, hardly believing what she had heard. You're falling in love with me? She repeated. I have been since the first night you arrived, Jake said quietly. I tried to tell myself it was just concern for Eleanor's granddaughter, but that was never the whole truth. Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. I was hoping you felt the same way I do. Jake's eyes widened. You mean? I mean I'm falling in love with you too. I have been for weeks, but I was afraid to say anything. I didn't want you to think I was just grateful for your help. Jake lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. I would never think that. You're the strongest woman I've ever met, Sarah. You don't need rescuing. No, Sarah agreed. But I do need a partner. Someone to share this life with. Jake stood up and walked around the table to where Sarah was sitting. He pulled her to her feet and looked down into her eyes. Are you sure about this? He asked. All of it. The ranch, the cattle, me. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, Sarah said. Jake leaned down and kissed her, softly at first, then with more passion as Sarah responded. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. So, Jake said, his forehead resting against hers, about that business partnership. Sarah laughed. I think we can work out the details. And the personal partnership? I think we can work that out too. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the same kitchen, preparing dinner for a dozen guests. Jake's friends and neighbors had become her friends and neighbors, and the house that had once been silent was now filled with laughter and conversation. Through the window, she could see Jake working with their small herd of cattle in the pasture beyond the barn. They had started with 10 head and already had plans to expand. The vegetable garden had exceeded all expectations, providing enough produce to sell at the farmer's market and still have plenty for their own needs. Betty knocked on the back door and entered without waiting for an answer, carrying a large pot of her famous chili. How are you holding up, honey? Betty asked, setting the pot on the stove. Good, Sarah said, and meant it. A little nervous about the announcement, but good. Jake doesn't suspect anything? Not a thing. He thinks this is just a regular dinner party. Betty grinned. He's going to be over the moon. An hour later, the house was full of people celebrating the end of harvest season. Jake had showered and changed into clean clothes, and Sarah thought he looked more handsome than ever. He moved through the room easily, talking with friends and making sure everyone had food and drinks. She could smell coffee and bacon coming from the kitchen. After getting dressed quickly, she found Jake standing at the stove, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt. He looked different in the morning light, younger somehow, and more relaxed. "Morning," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "Hope you slept well. Coffee's ready." Sarah poured herself a cup and sat at the small kitchen table. Through the window, she could see rolling green pastures with cattle scattered across them. The view was nothing like Chicago. "This is beautiful," she said. "How long have you lived here?" "About 8 years," Jake replied, placing a plate of eggs and bacon in front of her. "I moved here from Denver after my father passed. Left me this place." They ate breakfast in comfortable silence. Sarah found herself studying Jake's face, wondering about his story. He seemed like someone who was used to taking care of himself and others. "Ready to see your inheritance?" he asked when they finished eating. The drive to Eleanor's ranch took them deeper into the countryside. Jake's truck bumped along a dirt road that wound through meadows and past a small creek. Sarah saw deer grazing near the tree line and hawks circling overhead. "There," Jake said, pointing ahead. "That's the Morrison place." Sarah's heart jumped as she saw her grandmother's house for the first time. It was bigger than she had expected, a 2-story farmhouse with a wide front porch and tall windows. The white paint was peeling, and some of the porch boards looked loose, but the basic structure seemed solid. Behind the house stood a red barn that was in better condition than the house, and beyond that were several fenced pastures. The property stretched back toward forested hills that looked like they went on forever. Jake parked near the front porch, and they got out of the truck. Sarah walked slowly toward the house, trying to imagine her grandmother living here alone for so many years. "The key should be under the flower pot," Jake said. Sarah found it exactly where he said it would be. The front door opened with a loud creak, and they stepped inside. The house smelled like dust and old wood, but it was not unpleasant. Sunlight came through the windows, showing a living room with comfortable furniture covered by sheets. Everything was clean, but clearly had not been used in months. "Eleanor kept the place neat," Jake said. "She was particular about that." They walked through the downstairs rooms, a large kitchen with an old wood stove, a dining room with a table for 6, a small office filled with books and papers. Sarah touched everything carefully, as if she might disturb her grandmother's spirit. Upstairs were 3 bedrooms and a bathroom. The master bedroom still had Eleanor's clothes hanging in the closet and family photographs on the dresser. Sarah picked up a picture of a young couple standing next to an old car. "That's your grandmother and grandfather," Jake said. "Tom Morrison. He died about 15 years ago." Sarah studied the photograph. Eleanor looked strong and confident, with the same dark hair that Sarah had inherited. Tom was tall and lean, with kind eyes, and a cowboy hat similar to the one Jake wore. "He was a good man," Jake continued. "Taught me a lot about raising cattle and fixing things that were broken." They went back downstairs to the kitchen, where Jake began checking the water pipes and electrical connections. Sarah explored the office, looking through books and papers that told the story of her grandmother's life. She found newspaper clippings about local events, recipes written in Eleanor's careful handwriting, and letters from friends. In one drawer, she discovered a small wooden box filled with photographs. Most of the pictures showed life on the ranch, cattle drives, harvest time, community gatherings. But at the bottom of the box, Sarah found something that made her hands tremble. It was a letter addressed to her, written in her grandmother's handwriting. The envelope was marked, "For Sarah, when she comes home." Sarah opened the letter carefully. Eleanor's writing was clear and strong. "My dear granddaughter," it began, "if you are reading this, then you have found your way to Cedar Valley. I always hoped you would come, though I never had the courage to reach out while I was alive. I was afraid that too much time had passed, that too many mistakes had been made. Your father was a good man, but we disagreed about many things. When he left for Chicago with your mother, I thought it was temporary. I thought he would bring his family back to the ranch where they belonged. Instead, years passed, and the distance between us grew larger. By the time I realized my mistake, your father had died, and you were living with Margaret. I wrote letters, but never sent them. I was too proud and too stubborn. It is one of my greatest regrets. This ranch has been in our family for 3 generations. Your great-grandfather built the barn with his own hands, and your grandfather planted the apple trees behind the house. Every fence post and gate has a story. Every pasture has memories. I am leaving it to you because I believe you have the strength to make something good of this place. The ranch needs young hands and a young heart. It needs someone who can see possibilities instead of problems. The house needs work, but Jake Carter will help you. He has been like a son to me these past few years. He is honest and reliable, and he knows this land almost as well as I do. There is money in the bank. Not much, but enough to get you started if you are careful. The account information is in my desk drawer. Most importantly, remember that this land will teach you things about yourself that you cannot learn anywhere else. It will show you that you are stronger than you think and more capable than you know. I hope you will choose to stay. I hope you will make this ranch your home. But if you decide to sell and return to the city, I will understand. Do what makes you happy, dear one. With all my love and hopes for your future, your grandmother, Eleanor Webb Morrison. Sarah was crying by the time she finished reading. She held the letter against her chest and tried to imagine what her life might have been like if her grandmother had found the courage to send those letters she had written. Jake appeared in the doorway. Everything okay? Sarah showed him the letter. He read it quietly, his expression growing softer with each paragraph. She meant every word, he said when he finished. Eleanor talked about you more often than you might think. She was proud of you for working your way through school and taking care of yourself. The house needs so much work, Sarah said, looking around the dusty room. And I don't know anything about running a ranch. The house has good bones, Jake said. Most of what it needs is cleaning and basic repairs. As for the ranch, well, that's something you can learn if you want to. They spent the rest of the morning exploring the property. Jake showed her the barn, which was in surprisingly good condition, and the pastures where Eleanor had raised cattle and horses. He pointed out the apple orchard her grandfather had planted and a vegetable garden that could be restored. The well is good, he said, checking the pump house. And the septic system was updated a few years ago. Your grandmother made sure the important things were taken care of. By noon, Sarah was overwhelmed with information and possibilities. They drove back to Jake's house for lunch, where she could think more clearly. What would you do? She asked as they sat on his front porch. If you were me? Jake was quiet for a long time, looking out at the hills. I can't answer that for you, he said finally. But I can tell you what I see when I look at that place. What do you see? I see a ranch that could support a small herd of cattle or horses. I see gardens that could grow enough vegetables to sell at the farmer's market in Millfield. I see a house that could be beautiful again with some care and attention. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to imagine herself living at the ranch. The idea was both terrifying and exciting. How would I even begin? She asked. Same way everyone begins, Jake said. One day at a time. Fix what's broken, clean what's dirty, plant what needs planting. That afternoon, Jake drove her back to Cedar Valley to visit the bank and meet with Eleanor's lawyer. The bank account contained enough money to live modestly for about 6 months if Sarah was careful. The lawyer explained that the property taxes were current and that Eleanor had left instructions for all her debts to be paid from a separate account. Your grandmother was very organized, the lawyer said. She wanted to make sure you would have a clean start if you decided to keep the ranch. They had dinner at the Silver Dollar Saloon, where Betty insisted on treating Sarah like family. Several other local people stopped by their table to introduce themselves and share memories of Eleanor. She helped my family through a difficult time, said an older woman named Ruth. When my husband was sick, Eleanor brought us meals twice a week and never made us feel like charity cases. A young man named David told Sarah about the time Eleanor had taught him to repair a tractor engine. I was just 15 and thought I knew everything. She was patient with me even when I made mistakes. Each story helped Sarah understand her grandmother better. Eleanor had been more than just a rancher. She had been a pillar of the community, someone people could count on. After dinner, Jake drove Sarah back to his house. They sat on the porch again, drinking coffee and watching the stars come out. I think I want to try, Sarah said suddenly. Living at the ranch, I mean. At least for a while. Jake nodded. It won't be easy. Especially at first. I know. But I've been working 2 jobs just to afford a tiny apartment in Chicago. At least here, I would be working towards something that belongs to me. The house needs to be livable before you can move in, Jake said practically. That means getting the electricity working, fixing the plumbing, and making sure the roof doesn't leak. Sarah felt a wave of anxiety. She had never done any kind of home repair and had no idea where to start. I could help with that, Jake continued. If you want. I know the house pretty well from helping your grandmother over the years. Why would you do that? Sarah asked. You barely know me. Jake was quiet for a moment. I promised Eleanor I would look after the place if anything happened to her. And I guess I feel responsible for making sure her granddaughter has a fair chance to succeed here. Sarah studied his profile in the dim light from the house. There was something about Jake that made her feel safe, even though she had known him for less than 24 hours. How long would it take to make the house livable? A few weeks, maybe a month if we work steady. Depends on what we find when we start opening things up. Sarah made her decision. Okay, I want to do this. I want to fix up the house and try living there. Jake smiled, the first real smile she had seen from him. All right then. We'll start tomorrow morning. That night, Sarah lay in bed making mental lists of everything that needed to be done. She was scared about the challenges ahead, but for the first time in years, she was also excited about the future. She thought about her grandmother's letter and the faith Eleanor had shown in her. Maybe she really did have the strength to make something good of the ranch. Maybe this was exactly the fresh start she needed. Outside her window, she could hear coyotes calling in the distance and the wind moving through the trees. These were sounds she had never heard in Chicago, sounds that spoke of wide open spaces and possibilities she had never imagined. Tomorrow, she would begin the work of transforming her grandmother's house into her own home. It would be hard, but she would not be doing it alone. Jake had offered to help, and she sensed that his offer came from more than just obligation to Eleanor. Sarah smiled in the darkness and pulled the blankets up to her chin. For the first time since arriving in Cedar Valley, she felt like she might actually belong here. Sarah's hands shook as she clutched the crumpled bus ticket. The evening air was cold against her face, and the small town of Cedar Valley stretched before her like something from an old movie. She had never been this far from home, never been anywhere really. The bus driver had already pulled away, leaving her standing alone on the dusty road with nothing but a worn backpack and $23 to her name. She walked slowly toward the main street, her sneakers making soft sounds on the gravel. The town was quiet, almost too quiet. Most of the shops had their lights off, and only a few street lamps cast yellow circles on the empty sidewalks. Sarah pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders and wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. 3 weeks ago, her life had been completely different. She lived in Chicago with her Aunt Margaret, working at a small diner and saving money for college. Then, the letter came. The lawyer explained that her grandmother, who she had never met, had left her a small property in Cedar Valley. Sarah barely remembered her father talking about his mother, and she certainly never expected to inherit anything from her. When her aunt read the letter, her face changed. Your grandmother, Margaret said quietly. She was a stubborn woman. She left Chicago when your father was young and never came back. None of us understood why. But Sarah needed a fresh start. The city felt too big, too overwhelming. She had been working double shifts just to afford her tiny apartment, and college seemed like an impossible dream. Maybe this inheritance was exactly what she needed. Now, standing in the middle of Cedar Valley with nowhere to go, she was not so sure. Sarah walked past a small grocery store, a gas station, and what looked like an old movie theater. Everything seemed closed except for one place at the end of the street. Warm light spilled from the windows of a building with a wooden sign that read, "The Silver Dollar Saloon." She could hear voices and music coming from inside. She hesitated at the door. Sarah had never been in a bar before, but she needed information about her grandmother's property, and this seemed like the only place with people who might be able to help her. The door creaked as she pushed it open. The room was warmer than outside, filled with the smell of coffee and something that might have been chilly. About a dozen people sat at tables scattered around the room, and most of them looked up when she walked in. "Well, hello there," said a woman behind the bar. She had gray hair pulled back in a ponytail and kind eyes. "You look a little lost, honey." Sarah approached the bar slowly. "I'm looking for information about a property. My grandmother left me some land here, but I don't know where it is." "What was your grandmother's name?" the woman asked. "Eleanor Webb." Eleanor Webb Morrison after she got married. The entire room went quiet. Sarah noticed that several people were staring at her now, and she felt her cheeks getting warm. "Eleanor Webb," the woman repeated softly. "Well, I'll be. You must be little Sarah. Eleanor talked about you sometimes." "You knew my grandmother?" "Honey, everyone in Cedar Valley knew Eleanor. She lived out at the old Morrison Ranch for 40 years. My name is Betty, and this is my place." Betty gestured around the room. "Eleanor used to come in here every Friday for coffee and pie." An older man at a nearby table spoke up. "That ranch has been empty since Eleanor passed 6 months ago. It's about 8 miles north of town, up toward the mountains." Sarah felt her heart sink. 8 miles. In the dark. With no car and no money for a hotel room. Betty seemed to notice her expression. "Where are you planning to stay tonight, dear?" "I was hoping to go to the ranch, but—" Sarah's voice trailed off. 8 miles is too far to walk in the dark, Betty said firmly. "Especially if you don't know the way. There are no streetlights once you leave town, and the road can be tricky." Sarah looked down at her hands. She had been so focused on getting to Cedar Valley that she had not thought about practical things like where she would sleep her first night. "I have some money," she said quietly. "Is there a motel or something?" Betty shook her head. "Closest motel is 20 miles away in Millfield. But don't you worry, honey. We'll figure something out." Just then, the door opened, and a man walked in. He was tall, probably in his early 30s, wearing a worn cowboy hat and boots that looked like they had seen a lot of miles. His jacket was dusty, and there was something about the way he moved that suggested he spent most of his time outdoors. "Evening, Jake," Betty called out. "Perfect timing. Come over here." The man approached the bar, touching the brim of his hat politely when he saw Sarah. "Ma'am," he said simply. "Jake, this is Sarah. She's Eleanor Webb's granddaughter, just arrived from Chicago. She inherited the Morrison place." Jake's expression changed slightly. He looked at Sarah more carefully, as if he was trying to figure something out. "Eleanor's granddaughter," he repeated. "She mentioned you a few times. Said you were studying to be a teacher." Sarah was surprised. "She knew about me?" "Eleanor knew about everyone she cared about," Jake said, even if she had not seen them in years. Betty leaned forward. "Sarah needs a place to stay tonight. The ranch is too far to walk in the dark, and she does not have transportation." Jake was quiet for a moment, considering. Sarah noticed that his eyes were a deep brown color, and there were lines around them that came from spending time in the sun. "The ranch house is not in good shape," he said finally. "Eleanor was not able to keep up with repairs the last few years. No electricity, and the well pump needs work." Sarah felt her heart sink even further. She had imagined her grandmother's house as a cozy cottage where she could start her new life. Instead, it sounded like it was barely livable. "I can drive you out there tomorrow morning," Jake continued. "Show you around, help you figure out what needs to be done. But Betty's right about tonight. It is not safe to walk that road in the dark." "I don't have money for a hotel," Sarah said quietly. "I spent almost everything I had on the bus ticket." Jake and Betty exchanged a look. Sarah felt embarrassed admitting her financial situation to strangers, but she was too tired and overwhelmed to pretend everything was fine. "Well," Betty said slowly, "I have a small apartment upstairs, but it is full of storage boxes right now, and the couch down here is not very comfortable." Jake shifted his weight, clearly thinking about something. Finally, he spoke up. "I have a guest room at my place," he said. "It is clean and comfortable. You would have privacy, and I could drive you to the ranch first thing in the morning." Sarah looked at him uncertainly. She did not know anything about this man except that he seemed to know her grandmother. Betty must have noticed her hesitation. "Jake has been helping Eleanor with ranch work for the past 5 years," she said. "He's one of the most decent people in this town. You would be safe." "I understand if you are not comfortable with that," Jake said. "You do not know me, but the offer stands." Sarah looked around the room. The other people had gone back to their conversations, but she could feel their concern. These were people who had known her grandmother, people who seemed to care about what happened to her. "What kind of work do you do?" she asked Jake. "I run cattle on a small ranch about 3 miles from your grandmother's place. I also do repairs and maintenance for some of the older folks in the area. I was helping Eleanor fix her fence posts the week before she passed." Sarah made her decision. She was tired, scared, and completely out of options. Sometimes you had to trust people, especially when they were the only help available. "That is very kind of you," she said. "I accept your offer." "Thank you." Jake nodded. "My truck is outside. Whenever you are ready." Sarah finished the cup of coffee that Betty had placed in front of her and gathered her backpack. Betty walked around the bar and gave her a quick hug. "You come by tomorrow evening and tell me how things went at the ranch," Betty said. "And do not worry too much about the condition of the house. These old places have good bones, even when they need work." Jake held the door open for her, and Sarah stepped back into the cold night air. His truck was parked right outside, an older model with a dented tailgate, but clean windows. "Thank you for doing this," Sarah said as they got into the truck. "I was starting to panic about where I would sleep tonight." Jake started the engine and pulled away from the saloon. "Eleanor was a good woman," he said. "She would want someone to help her granddaughter." They drove through the quiet streets of Cedar Valley and then onto a road that led up into rolling hills. Sarah could see stars through the windshield, more stars than she had ever seen in Chicago. "What was she like?" Sarah asked. "My grandmother?" Jake was quiet for a moment, concentrating on the dark road. "Tough," he said finally. "Independent. She could fix almost anything and was not afraid of hard work. But she was kind too. She used to make extra food and bring it to families when someone was sick or out of work." "Why did she leave Chicago?" "My father never really explained it." "I do not know the whole story," Jake said. "But I think she wanted a simpler life. She used to say that cities made people forget who they really were." They turned onto a gravel driveway that led to a modest house with a covered porch. Jake parked the truck and grabbed Sarah's backpack from the back seat. "The guest room is just off the kitchen," he said as they walked toward the house. "Bathroom is down the hall. Make yourself comfortable." The house was warm and clean, with simple furniture and photographs of horses and landscapes on the walls. Jake showed her to a small bedroom with a comfortable-looking bed and a window that faced toward the mountains. "I will be up early to do chores," he said. "But sleep as long as you need to. We can drive out to your grandmother's place whenever you are ready." Sarah sat on the edge of the bed after Jake had said goodnight. She looked around the room and tried to process everything that had happened. This morning she had been in Chicago, worrying about rent money and wondering if she would ever be able to afford college. Now she was in a small town in the middle of nowhere, staying in a stranger's house, about to inherit property she had never seen. She pulled out her phone to call her Aunt Margaret, but there was no signal. Sarah realized that she was truly on her own now, further from everything familiar than she had ever been. But as she got ready for bed, she realized that for the first time in months, she was not worried about money or bills or whether she could afford groceries for the rest of the week. She was scared about the unknown, but it was a different kind of fear. It was the fear that came with new possibilities. Sarah turned off the light and lay down in the comfortable bed. Through the window, she could see moonlight on the hills and the distant outline of mountains. Somewhere out there was the ranch her grandmother had left her, the place where she might build a new life. Tomorrow she would see what Eleanor Webb had left behind, and she would begin to understand why her grandmother had chosen this quiet place over the busy world she had known before.